Friday, August 8th, 1862. Myself, General Winder, and Colonel Cunningham, who was on the sick list, rode leisurely during the morning. I cannot say in the cool of the morning, for it was an excessively hot spell of weather. We rode for about 10 miles to Orange Court House, and as both of them suffered from the heat in their weak condition, we stopped at Captain Erasmus Taylor's, north of that place, and there being nobody at the house, rested in the shade of the trees until near sundown. We then rode on slowly, crossed the Rapidan River at Barnett's Ford, and shortly after dark we found the brigade in bivouac in the woods on the left side of the road. The general laid down without giving any formal notice of his arrival. Sometime during the night we were awakened by an irregular firing in the rear and close at hand, and a number of bullets passed through the trees. Not knowing what it meant, the general directed me to order the regimental commanders to form their men. When I said to one of them, "Colonel, General Winder directs you to form your command," one of the sleeping soldiers raised his head from under his blanket and asked, "Has General Winder come up?" On my answering, "Yes." "Thank God for that," said he in a tone of evident relief. Something of the same sort occurred a second time, and I was struck by the sincerity of their confidence and satisfaction at his presence. Things quieted presently, but a second alarm came, and the general and staff then rode out to the open field, in rear where the trouble seemed to be, and finding other parts of the division under arms, we were told that a body of cavalry had suddenly ridden in on a road from the Madison Courthouse side, and after a brief firing they retired by the way they had came. I do not remember that anybody was struck on our side, and on examining the ground I saw no killed or wounded of the enemy. It was a very bright moonlit night about full moon, and the trees and fencing made deep shadows, causing firing to be wild and inaccurate. General Lawton, being the senior officer present, sent a note conveying General Winder's advice to Jackson, informing him of what had occurred and asking for instructions. Shortly after daylight, General Winder received a communication from General Jackson, the original of which I still have. General Lawton was one of the oldest of the brigadier generals in the service, but Winder's tried character and services under Jackson's own eye preferred him for the command, at last, of his favorite division, and I think it is certain that he would have retained it forever afterwards. It would have met the hearty approval of the other parts of the division, which at other times had willingly put themselves under his orders on the march and on the field of battle. Upon receiving Jackson's order, General Winder assumed command of the 3 brigades and moved forward on the Culpeper Courthouse Road. The day was hot and the dust oppressive, and the march was a slow one, for the reason also that the road was occupied by the troops in front. About midday we were nearly abreast, at the head of the column, of Slaughter's or Cedar Mountain on our right, and learned that the enemy were a short distance in front. Ewell's division, which had been ahead of us, went off the road to the right and occupied the ground to the base of Slaughter's Mountain, leaving the road itself in front and the country to its left to us. Our division was halted in column in the road for some time, and several of our generals, including Early and Ewell or Trimble, conversed for a while off the right of the road. I remember seeing my brother, Major Charles Howard, Early's chief commissary, a little behind them and apparently keeping out of sight, and on my asking the reason, he said that, being a commissary, his general had ordered him to go to his proper place in the rear, which he was not minded to do. At this time there was some skirmish firing to the right oblique in the direction of the west base of Slaughter's Mountain. By about 2 o'clock, Ewell's division had been moved in that direction, forward and to the right, and when our division was ordered forward, we found the road, and the ground on its left was unoccupied between us and the enemy, who, however, was not yet visible to us. Riding ahead with his staff, General Winder presently came to a point on the road where a fence with woods behind it ran off at right angles to the right, in front of which was a cleared field, the woods continuing, however, to the front on the left side of the road. Looking over the fence corner at the road, we saw in the distance across the open field the enemy's batteries directing their fire on Ewell's forces towards the mountain. The general immediately directed Major R. Snowden Andrews, Chief of Artillery of the division, to order up a rifled piece from the batteries of the Stonewall Brigade. Meanwhile, we pulled down at the section of the fence. The gun, or guns, soon came up and opened on the batteries of the enemy, and I think one or two more were brought up. At our first shot, the enemy turned his guns on us with a very heavy fire. Our position being at the apex of a right angle of open ground, with the two sides bordered by woods, gave him a fair mark for his converging fire, and soon the din of bursting shells, principally, we thought shrapnel, was quite appalling, made more so from the splintering of tree branches overhead. A number of battery commanders and other officers had gathered here, looking on and waiting orders, and there were some narrow escapes, although so far there was more noise than execution. I remember Captain Willie Caskey of Caskey's battery, attached to the Sutri Brigade, coming up to me in a half-dazed way and asking me just to look at his back. And on looking, I saw a broad, dusty streak across his shoulders, where a falling limb cut by a shell had struck him. About 4 o'clock, General Winder made his dispositions for a forward movement. Retaining at this point the 3rd Brigade, General William B. Taliaferro, in support of the artillery and for other service, and holding the 1st, or the Stonewall Brigade, in reserve, he directed me to order the 2nd Brigade to move to the front under cover of the woods on the left side of the road until he arrived on the flank of the nearest battery, which he was then to charge. I rode back and communicated these instructions to Colonel Garnett, and as he did not know the ground, I thought it best to accompany him a part of the way. We passed up about 100 yards inside the woods from the road, coming, however, under part of the artillery fire directed into the angle. I saw a shell explode in the column just behind me, which killed or wounded 4 or 5 men. Getting past this point and keeping with the brigade until it was some distance to the front and, I thought, required my services as a guide no longer. I had only been told to order it up. I was going diagonally back to the angle where I had left General Winder when I met Major Andrews riding hastily towards the direction from which I had come, who called out to me, "Go to the general." I asked, "Has anything happened?" But he only repeated, "Go to the general," and passed on. I hurried back and across the very short distance to the angle where I found General Winder lying dreadfully wounded by a piece of shell, which had passed between his left arm and side, tearing the flesh from the inside of the arm above and below the elbow and lacerating the left side as far back as the spine. He still had the use of the arm, but it was evident that the wound to the body was mortal. He had been placed on a stretcher and was not suffering as much pain as he would have suffered if the shock had not been so great. I leaned over him and asked, "General, do you know me?" Turning his eyes to my face with a look of recognition, he answered, "Oh, yes," and said some words of sorrow for his wife and children. Other friends and followers were standing around, full of grief, but he paid no attention to them. His thoughts were of home and family, and he turned to me as a link with those associations. Surgeons came to his side, but there was not the slightest hope, and all that could be done was to alleviate his sufferings in his last moments. A chaplain bent over him and said, "General, lift up your heart to God." He replied, I do lift it up to him." He was presently carried by men towards a place of quiet in the rear. Just as we were starting, the Stonewall Brigade filed by, moving to attack, and officers crowded around with sincere sorrow on their faces while the men passed by in silence, taking a last look at the leader who had so well won their confidence and attachment. Perhaps prompted by this, he asked me how the battle was going and seemed gratified at my reply. He became quieter presently, and as I walked beside with his hand in mine, I could feel it growing colder. At a stream crossing the road about half a mile back, I met a part of A.P. Hill's division going to the west side of the road on its way to the front. A quarter of a mile further, we stopped in a grove surrounding a church or schoolhouse on the west side of the road. By this time, I suppose it was after 6 o'clock, he had become totally unconscious, and at sundown, with my arm around his neck and supporting his head, he expired so quietly that I could scarcely mark the exact time of his death. I placed General Winder's body in an ambulance and started it back to Orange Courthouse. But learning that Major R. Snowden Andrews, Chief of Artillery of the division, had been desperately wounded and had been carried back to the Garnett House, I rode over to see him. He was in a lower room of the house. A fragment of shell, apparently, had torn the wall and laid open the right side of the abdomen, and passing on, I suppose, had cut the top of the thigh over the joint. The former wound had opened widely so that my hand would have about covered the place and the intestines were fully exposed. There was a surgeon or assistant surgeon with him. Dr. Black, senior surgeon of the brigade, stopped for a while, whom I asked if there was any hope. He said no, that the wound was not necessarily fatal as a wound, but that inflammation would be certain to set in, and we were having an extremely hot spell of weather. But Major Andrews was perfectly cool and composed, and even cheerful, and no one in the next room listening to the natural tone of his voice as he gave directions about himself could have believed the wounded man was doing the talking. "Doctor," said he to one of the surgeons, "how many chances have I?" And receiving no reply, he added, 1 out of 10, or perhaps 1 out of 20. "Not more than that," answered the surgeon gravely. "Well," said he cheerfully, "I am going to hold on to my 1 chance," which the doctor had not promised him. When the wound was sewed, he aided with his own hands in bringing the sides together. Most reluctantly, I left him, expecting to never see him again. Before I went, he drew off and gave me his seal ring to be given to his wife in case of a fatal result. I overtook the ambulance at no great distance, the road being much blocked by the army wagons which were coming up. From the front, there had been the sound of cannon until long after nightfall. Captain John F. O'Brien, Assistant Adjutant General, had accompanied me with the ambulance, and he now rode on ahead to make arrangements at Orange Courthouse, if possible, for the transportation of the general's body to Richmond. Day broke when I passed over the Rapidan at Barnett's Ford, and I well remember the purple clouds above the rising sun and the oppressive heat even at that early hour. Arriving at Orange Courthouse, I found that Captain O'Brien had not been able to make any arrangements, and there being no connection, by rail or telegraph, with Gordonsville, the nearest point in communication with Richmond, and the weather being extremely hot, I reluctantly submitted to the necessity of burying the general, temporarily at least, at this place. The Freemasons offered a lot in their part of the cemetery, situated on the Gordonsville Road, half a mile south of the town. The place was full of officers slightly wounded in the battle or going to the front, and when I announced that the funeral was about to take place and invited all to join, a large number followed the coffin to the Episcopal Church, where there were many ladies and citizens of the town. Thence, after part of the burial service, a long line went to the grave, where at sunset was buried the best soldier under Lee and Jackson in the Army of Northern Virginia. As for Major Andrews, his was the worst wound I ever knew anyone to recover from, and I have always attributed his recovery largely to his remarkable coolness and indomitable will. I had the pleasure of restoring his ring some months afterwards. He had to wear a silver plate over the place of the wound he received there at Cedar Run for the rest of his life.
If you enjoyed today's video and would like to see more content like this, be sure to take a shot at the like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest BirdDogg content. And if you'd like to support the channel, for a limited time there's exclusive Civil War Diaries merchandise available in the video link below.